Hello there, and it's great to see you again, Barry Murray of the Peadar Socialist Republican Forum. How are you doing?
Not too bad.
Good to see you again because it's important that we continue that conversation that we had last week. And if you remember in the last podcast, we talked about how poverty is sort of normalized and hidden from society. But then at the end of the podcast, we just were beginning to uncover the real roots of why that's the case, like that it's not just some accident or unfortunate byproduct of the way we're living today. It's actually a systemic inequality and exploitation. And like when you start to pull on those threads, you start to, then we were only beginning really the last day to ask the bigger questions, like about economics, about power, about control, and even then the way that society is structured. So it'd be great to be able to pick up from there, Barry, and maybe talk about sort of those things, even about, how do we determine how well off people are, even financially, or can we?
Well, I mean, there's probably great variation in people's financial circumstances, but I mean, what you're talking about here is sort of broad terms. There's sort of two main things that kind of determine your wealth to a greater or lesser extent, although it's not fixed either. You have an income, or maybe in an increased number of cases, sort of fragmented incomes coming in now, multiple fragmented incomes, if I could get it right. And then the other side to that is obviously the outgoings, the rent and the mortgage and the regular bills and whatever else it takes to keep you going. Like, so it's sort of your disposable income, and it's what's left over is your disposable income. So an awful lot of people know all this anyway. I mean, we're only just sort of saying what people are struggling through this. I mean, this is what people fight every day of the week, so they're well familiar with it. It's not something that's new to them. What they mightn't know is, with all their sort of budgeting and all their saving and all their two, maybe three jobs, or certainly two, maybe three incomes, they still find themselves in poverty. And the question then arises, as we said in the last podcast, what causes poverty? And it's clear that it's inequality and exploitation that causes poverty. So maybe what we'll do is sort of look at, the inequality side of things, and then we can deal with the exploitation side of it then, at a
Another
later
time.
date.
Like just going back to the inequality, I think people are so familiar with that word, but being familiar with the word, I mean, do we really understand it? Like, where does actually inequality come from? Where does it stem from?
Well, again, a bit like your income, it probably has a lot of different causes, but largely speaking, I mean, it's where people start off from that decides how they get on in life. It's something that people sort of don't think about. They look at somebody and they say, oh, they done very well for themselves. But what they don't think about is, where did they start from? Where did those people get the money to go, we'll say, to a higher level of education? Where did they get the money to build a better quality house than the house maybe that you live in, a little council house, or maybe an older home or whatever? Still a home, of course. And if your parents or your family relations somewhere along the line have lots of wealth, and have maybe property or whatever, they can sort of start you off. And an awful lot of people, you'll find if you track it back, who do reasonably well in life, have people who are behind them to get them started off, to get the first step on the ladder. And then, of course, it's into debt and borrowing and stuff after that. But I mean, even to do that, you have to have backing. You have to have somebody to guarantor you. You have to have a house or property or whatever. So it's not a simple case of somebody who's living in poverty that they can just suddenly start up a business and away they go. It's not just like that. But you
Well,
do have.
they all will start in life with a bit of an advantage over
Yeah,
others.
well, different starting places, different starting points. We're not all equal, and it's not a case that, if we work hard enough and long enough and grind ourselves into the ground working, we'll eventually get to the very top. That's not necessarily the case at all. And it's you hear these sort of rags to riches stories, but the reality is that that's in the minority. although the powers that be and the business classes and that, the people who promote wealth and business and stuff, they'll make a big deal about some person who came from what appeared to be a very poor background, and they suddenly make it good. But I mean, as I said, it's in the minority, and that in itself, how that happened is a whole other story. You know what I mean? It doesn't just happen like it reads. I mean, it ends up that maybe even those people who do make it to a certain level are in fact end up exploiting people who work for them, or there becomes an inequality then between the worker and the newfound business person who came from nothing, apparently.
So you're just perpetuating the cycle, but also because it's exception as well, it's not the rule. But it's used, those exceptions are always used. I'm just thinking of like the Sir Alan Sugars and all of that. These boys that made it big. But again, the media helps to maintain this illusion by platforming these people, and then they become sort of celebrity, likable figures. Not all, by the way, but it's the fact that it is the exception and not the rule is something that we tend to forget, or we're not reminded of it anyway.
Yeah, and the whole image is created that if you compete hard enough and work hard enough, you can be like them. You can be them too, that's not necessarily the case at all. Like, what we are talking about here is the structural inequality. I mean, the unequal quality in housing, and I mean the expense of housing and somewhere to live proportionately affects people who have lower incomes than those who have a better income. So there's an inbuilt inequality there, and it also applies in education and healthcare. I mean, none of this is sort of some kind of an accident or some kind of it's not even mismanagement. In fact, it's the direct opposite, because all of this housing, education, healthcare, everything that we need in life is linked to profit. That's where we have the case in the south of Ireland at the minute in particular, and indeed the north too. I mean, it doesn't get mentioned to the same extent, but it's just equally as bad in the north, where housing, for example, is deliberately being held back to create higher prices for the investors and higher prices for the multinational housing companies who come in to have been flooded the island of Ireland to build houses and not build houses where it suits.
And that's the thing. Like, often you hear people who are critical, who recognise, and that nobody can deny there's a housing crisis, but often you hear, sort of the more liberal mindset will say, well, it's due to incompetence, or there's no accountability, and there's an avoidance to accept the fact that it's a deliberate outcome of a divided society.
Well, nobody thinks that, that a government or institutions of government would set about doing that. They can't bring themselves to accept that, because then when you accept that point, then you have to ask the question, why? Why would that be done? And then you're obviously into the profit motive. And of course, those within the who have a liberal agenda don't really want to question the profit motive, because they're probably involved in the profit motive themselves at some level. And indeed, workers don't really see a problem with profit either, because the way they see it is that if my company's not making a profit, I'll not have a job. Mm-hmm. So for them, it's a kind of a vicious circle too. However unequal it is, and it is unequal, they still find it difficult to be able to sort of rationalise that the inequality is inbuilt into the system and is part of the system that we live under.
And even like the last day we talked about, the wording of like in deprived areas, but actually like poorer areas will have worse housing and fewer public services.
Even things as basic as play parks. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? If you go to a well-financed area, I mean, the play parks, there might be 2 or 3 in an area, whereas a massive working class area will maybe have a very poor and dilapidated park system. I mean, you see it all the time.
Oh, I see it in my area. Like, we are, even Patrick, like a child can see it and say, how come up in another area, Bushy Park in Terranure, how come they have, well, first of all, a bigger park and a much more well-maintained park?
Yeah.
Even notice like the number of swings, even though there's actually a bigger proportion of families compacted and living in and contained within this area, which is Crumlin, a working class area. So I mean,
those are clear demonstrations of inequality.
Yeah.
I mean, even a child can see it.
So it's necessarily that it's just about the rich having more.
Well, it's not necessarily just about that, but I mean, the system is designed to ensure that the more that they have got is at the very worst or the very least retained, and more importantly, that it's increased way and beyond what's even necessary to survive at the expense of those who don't have the ability to create that type of wealth for themselves. They're wage slaves, so they're limited by what amount of work they can do and how long they can work for. And I mean, the amount of people out there in society in the whole island of Ireland that have to have benefits as well as working. I mean, it was once upon a time that there was only people who didn't or wouldn't work, as they said, that was on benefits, but that is no longer the case. That, people who are working are subsidised by benefits simply because they can't survive, they can't get by. And I mean, and it's the poor and working poor class that you see that happening in almost exclusively.
So maybe talk about just going back to workers, like small business owners, managers, all of those, well, like the different layers. I think we touched on that actually the last day, but maybe the different types of workers there are.
Yeah, well, there is that too. You see, I mean, even just at the very basic level, like within the workforce, then you have all these various levels. But all those levels are created deliberately as a control system to ensure that the maximum amount of profits are taken out of a business. If you don't have good managers, then in theory, you don't have a good business, in theory. And if you don't have a good business, then as far as the owners and investors are concerned, then it doesn't have big enough and the best possible profits. So it's a chain of command that's deliberately set up to extract the most wealth possible out of any and every business, with the workers, the ordinary worker at the very bottom. But the same thing happens to a greater or lesser extent then as you go up the pyramid, the famous economic pyramid that is the widest at the bottom, of course, which is the working class, poor and working poor. And then the next level is sort of the middle class. And then the next level above that is sort of the extremely wealthy, very wealthy. And then at the very top, you have the 6 or 8 men who own 50% of the world's wealth. So each one of those levels are in competition with each other. And I mean, that's what drives the whole system. And the worker, of course, is involved at every level and being exploited increasingly at every level. Because, I mean, they do not get the reward for the wealth that they have ever created. That doesn't happen. They get a wage and that's it. It doesn't matter how much wealth. I mean, if they created £1,000 worth of wealth in a day, they still only get 50 or 60, or maybe if they're lucky, £100. So, and the rest of the wealth, that wealth goes to the business owners, to managers, indeed, the higher level of managers, through bonuses, and also investors and whatever else, banks.
But like when you talk about that small number of billionaires, say for example, who have the big swaths of wealth, like even when you define wealth, like I think we forget that they also control the resources as well, and then they have the influence. So it's not just about economic like hierarchy. This system is disguised as democracy.
Democracy, yeah. And I mean, and they have the political clout within that democracy that you and I don't have, because I mean they are part of massive lobby groups that go to governments and say, listen, we want wages to be capped this year and next year and the year after and the year after that, and we don't want those big taxes that you're talking about. I mean, we had the classical example of Apple in Ireland. There was it 30 billion of tax money lying in a escrow account, and the ludicrous situation was that the Dublin government didn't want to take it back to use it. They actually went to court to not take it back. And Apple
was that bad? You explain that, like why would the Irish government not accept those taxes?
Well, I mean, it was part of the European regulations, as I understand it, that on part of the agreement with the company that they were to pay a certain level of tax. I mean, the background story apparently is that there was a sweetheart deal done. Yeah, they were supposed to pay 20% corporate tax, but in fact they were paying less corporate tax than probably you pay or I pay.
To keep them here in Ireland?
To keep them here in Ireland, and from the government perspective, I mean, that was jobs, so that kept them politically stable. So, I mean, everything in economics is absolutely linked to the politics, and as you mentioned, democracy for what it's worth. And these people have power. I mean, again, it's a clear demonstration of inequality between the level of the worker and the ordinary person on the street, and the type of power that these businesses and companies have through lobby groups, through pressure groups, through political influence. I mean, they blatantly will fund political parties to be on their side. I mean, how can the ordinary person on the street compete with that? They can if they knew how to, but I mean, in the average, they don't see that they can compete with that type of power, and it's difficult. I mean, it's not going to be a simple task.
Here we are as workers creating this wealth and getting a tiny wee bit of fraction of its value.
Yeah.
And the rest is all profit dividends accumulated by the tiny minority.
Well, it goes to, I mean, it goes to the gaming bank accounts and yachts and investments in property and bonuses to investors and all sorts of things. It'll go anywhere. I mean, we even see now the case in both England and Europe, whereby vast amounts of money are about to be spent on military weapons. I mean, vast amounts. And that there's money they can even borrow. There's even an initial borrowing pot in Europe of 150 billion euros to finance the manufacture of arms and weapons of death. And yet, if you look about trying to get the health service, a few million for the health service, you can't get it. If you try and get a few million for children in schools to get extra help in schools, you can't get it either. There is no money, they'll tell you. And this is the outworking of the inequality of the system that we live under. It's dominated on the extraction of wealth and the accumulation of wealth and the domination of the working class and the system we live under. And I mean, there can't possibly be any equality in the like of that. Like, I mean, it's not there.
No, that's the political reality.
Well, the economic reality is the political reality. I mean, that's it. A lot of people divorce these things in their head and think, I go to work. I mean, it's a classical thing within unions, for example. We're only interested in good jobs for the workers and ensuring them good working conditions and all like that there. But they'll not touch the politics of all of that with a 40-foot pole, because they know what they have to do then. They have to challenge. They will eventually have to take it to its logical conclusion. They'll have to challenge the system, and they don't want to do that.
Well, it's actually great to see the French dockers and the Italian dockers. You sent me a good YouTube tip today of how they are rejecting to handle the military goods that are to be shipped to Haifa in Palestine. So, there is definitely a realization now. I think people are starting to think about themselves as exploited workers and compromised workers who are doing kind of carrying out the dirty work as well, and they're refusing to do that now. That exploitation, they're standing up to that type of exploitation as well.
Well, I suppose we also need to look at we've looked at inequality. I mean, there's an awful lot of stuff that you could get into here, but I mean, the other part of poverty is the exploitation, and I think that's something that maybe we should deal with in the next podcast, if that's possible.
That would be great to dig deeper into how the wealth is actually created, or as we say, stolen under this current. That would be good to maybe pick up there for next week. Barry, thanks very much. As you say, there's only limited time and we could explain inequality to the cows come home, but this is just a wee snapshot to get people thinking that inequality isn't just by accident, it is by design. Thanks
absolutely by design, and it's what promotes the system and keeps the system running. Because if there wasn't, I mean, if you as a boss or as a manager wouldn't be able to reap the rewards of the work that the workers do, I mean, you wouldn't. And this is another area. I mean, workers don't even fully appreciate. Most workers don't fully even appreciate how much they are being exploited, and in fact, that it's their wages or stolen wages, in fact, that creates the profits for the companies. But I mean, that's a whole other discussion again, which we can do.
But your conversations like this open up our eyes to realize what are we doing here in this earth and in our lifetime? What are we contributing, and who's actually benefiting from not just like our labour, our time here, which is being stolen from us too. So thanks, Barry. I'll
Okay,
talk to you, and all the best.
thank
Slán.
you. Thanks, Slán. Slán.